It's
raining
raining
yet.
in Wales.
Okay, nearly there.
Arizona. Actually raining in Portsmouth. Hey, Carl. Maryland. Sinead from sunny Glasgow, indeed.
Right, we are live streaming, so we're good to go.
Okay, we will kick off. Welcome everyone to this Perspectives on the Perspectives on Fantasy series event, if we're being far too meta about it. I am Matthew Sangster. I am the co-director of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic at the University of Glasgow with my colleague Dimitri Feeney, and with Brian Atterbury and Dimitri Feeney, we edit the Perspectives on Fantasy series, which has just published its fifth book. There are, I think, 7 or 8 more in progress, so it is going well. Brian's going to say a little bit more about the series in general. I'm just here to do the overall admin, so just to welcome you and say we're going to have a series of talks from authors or editors of books in the series, and after that we will have some time for questions. There is a specific Q&A function on this Zoom, so if you have questions and they occur to you during someone's talk, don't hold back until the question section. If you don't want to, feel free to put the questions in the Q&A and we'll answer those as they come through. So it's just a sort of, if you scroll along the bottom, there's a Q&A button. You can just type the questions in there. We can pick them up from the chat as well. It's just a little bit easier for us if they end up filed there. So I will hand over now to Brian Atterbury, who's going to say a little bit about fantasy scholarship and about the Perspective series, and then we will work through the books in publication order. So go ahead, Brian, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I guess this is Perspectives on Fantasy. And why does this series exist? What do we hope it turns into, and so on? I think these occasions are a nice time to stop and look back and look ahead. So this is where we've been and where we're going in fantasy scholarship. And I can speak from quite long experience, the longest I think here as a fantasy scholar, or the most endurance. There really was not much out there when I started looking as a graduate student studying fantasy. And some of what was out there was not very useful. Todorov. But at that time, it seemed like there were really 3 efforts that needed to be made before anything else could happen. One was just to locate fantasy, just to identify, survey, see how broad the field was. The second was to catalog and classify what we found. And then to defend fantasy, which meant both in the Philip Sidney sense, as well as the more obvious sense of fending off ill-intentioned critiques of the genre. And so I'll quote Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poesy very briefly here, which I think is interesting because it's not about fantasy, what he has to say. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow in effect into another nature, in making things either better than nature brings forth, or quite anew, forms such as never were in nature, such as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like. So as he goes hand in hand with nature, not enclosed within the narrow warrant of her gifts, but freely ranging within the zodiac of his own wit, which I was surprised how apt that seemed to me. Once those first steps began to be made, I think the next phase of fantasy scholarship came not to replace that effort, but to add to it. So each of these is kind of additive as we go along. The next steps that I saw were analyzing fantasy on its own terms rather than as a flawed version of something else. And then situating fantasy in history, which means literary history, cultural history, and I guess historical history. Fantasy does not exist outside of time and space. Well, with our series, I think we are are beginning to add another layer of scholarship to those. And one of those has to do with differentiating fantasy, which means starting to look at individual authors, forms, schools, audiences, purposes, and so on, as if they were all different things, that there's not a single answer. And then tracking the spread of fantasy into different cultural settings and new media. So those are some of the things that we are beginning to see happen in the world of fantasy scholarship, and we are pleased with the role that our series is playing in those developments. So we are here to celebrate 3 new publications that do these things and perhaps more. These are books that may turn out after the fact to signal still further directions for study. And so I'm going to turn this over to one of my co-series editors and the co-editor of one of these volumes that we're celebrating today, Dimitra.
Hey there, thank you so much, Brian. Actually, I think I'm going to let Alistair start about our book, Imagining the Celtic Past in Modern Fantasy, because it was his idea to begin with, and he's going to tell us a bit about how it all started, and then I'll talk a bit more about the book. Alistair, you go for it.
So I'm Alistair. I'm an independent scholar and a bookseller. And the idea came, I've been out of academia for probably 3 or 4 years. I did my PhD in fictional narratives, and it came from a relationship with Dimitra, from knowing her for quite a long time, but never actually meeting her. So I talked to her through my dissertation in 2007, 8, where I was looking at Tolkien and archaeology, and then from a PhD in 2014 sort of time, looking at fictional narratives in archaeology. And so I was 3 years later, 2017, I was invited to go to the Celtic Symposium in Bangor, North Wales, from my professor Raymond Carl, and I was doing an article on Celtic obsession in modern fantasy. And so I was talking to Dimitra online, saying, "Are you going to join us? Are you going to come to the conference?" She was too busy because there's so many other conferences to go to. So I asked about advice on what sort of I should have put in this article, and I'm really going to be looking at David Gemmell and a few other modern authors. And I found as I was reading it, there weren't that many modern fantasy authors examined at all. Your advice was look at Sullivan, and I went back and said, yeah, but he only looks at certain authors before a period of time. And the response from that was, oh, do I have to write another book? Which was quite funny. So I immediately went, well, do you want to join me? I'm thinking of writing it. And your response to that was, ooh. So that was the first spark of this whole discussion. And then we went and talked about how would we do it? Would we do it as a monograph or a edited volume? And we decided on edited volume mainly for our own sanity. We were both very busy at that time. Dimitra had lots of other things to do, and I was starting my own publishing to publish dyslexic-friendly books for adults at the time. So we were really busy. So the editing was the way to do it. And so our first real meeting was in 2017 in Cardiff. I went up to the train, joined, and we had a lovely chat about how we could do this. And from there, we started to build a idea for a call for papers, and that we wanted it to be modern 1980s onwards authors, and especially adult authors, because a lot of it has been children, not adults. And we got a really good response back when we actually did the call for papers from authors who are essentially Patricia. Remind me the name because my memory's gone because I'm dyslexic.
Henry Norris, that's fine.
Yeah, with the Celtiad series, and we also had another author for David Gemmell article. So from a different perspective, this time mine was looking at mythology based. The author was looking at the classical period. So those butting together was a really good find for us, and it really gave us a nice dimension of analysing the author. But we also had stuff coming from different foreign language, so from Scottish dialect, Gaelic, and also French, and that gave us another dimension, which was really, I think we actually did need in the end. And then we had the macro, the looking at the perceptions of fantasy with communities, and so we basically had in the end 4 different sections that went really well. And I'm going to let Dimitri carry on and talk about that.
Sure. So yeah, it was. I mean, I think that's important to talk about how these projects come together, because when the book appears on the shelf and it all looks very shiny and very well thought through, you know, people don't realize that sometimes this project goes back many, many years, as you must realize from the chronology that Alistair just gave now. And it takes a while, you know, it takes that digestion and takes sort of discussions, and it takes meetings. You know, we all met together a few times as well. So yeah, for me, this was a very natural thing as a follow-up to my second monograph, Celtic Myth in Contemporary Children's Fantasy. And as Alistair was saying, there was quite a bit of writing on the Celtic world as an inspiration for children's fantasy, but not very much at all on adult fantasy. And yes, another monograph was not really in the books for me at that particular time. I felt completely exhausted from the previous one. And also actually edited collections, the strength of edited collections is that you open up a number of different voices and a number of different perspectives. And I think one of the best things, as Alistair also sort of implied there, is that we heard from people we didn't know. No, I think some people who expected to respond to this, but also people from other perspectives and other disciplines came in, like classics, for example, or different languages, etc. So the book, for me, what it manages to do is to put together a number of different voices that look at how contemporary fantasy has been inspired by the Celtic world. And the Celtic world, you know, the way that the Celtic world is popularly understood, because Celtic studies is a complicated area. It could be seen as part of a, you know, philological, so linguistic study. Archaeology is another area, or contemporary history and folklore is yet another area. But the book does a good job, I think, of bringing these areas together and thinking also about some central terms like Celticity and Celticism. So how each author conceptualizes and understands what Celtic really means, which is something that in academic discourses is quite a contested term, actually, and not everybody agrees on it. And also how each author then decides to represent this and to create a fantasy world out of it, or to create an intrusion fantasy out of it. So I like the fact that the book represents all of those different possible meanings of Celtic, both linguistic and folkloric and mythological and historical and archaeological as well. So all of these things came together very nicely. And we had some amazing contributors. I think some of them are with us today. So I'm going to quickly sort of go through the topics, and then I'll pass on to our next speaker. So we have an article on the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by K.A. Leahy, which is a brilliant opening to the volume that actually looked at something that's been overlooked in the study of this, you know, very, very, very multifaceted and complex novel, which is the fairy element of it is Celtic. It comes from the Celtic fringes rather than England, which is where more of the plot is sort of focusing. So the Celtic world at the edges is a perennial discussion point as well in Celtic scholarship, both historical and medieval and mythological. We had then an article by Gwendolyn Grant on Alan Garner's Boneland. I was particularly happy with that because this is, again, a book about which very little has been written. And it's one of those weird books that comes as the third book in a trilogy where the first two books are children's books, but Boneland is definitely not. And it does some very, very clever and complicated things, just like Alan Garner tends to do with again, both folkloric Celticity, but also more medieval Celticity as well. And then we have in that first part, which is all about fantasy as intrusion, we have the essay by Chris Wank, which is on woman as goddess in the Irish fantasies of Jodie McIsaac. And these again are very, very contemporary books. We have again the fantastic intruding into the mundane world, and we have some very powerful Celtic female characters being part of that. The second part then is looking at fantasy worlds and heroes. This is where, as Alistair said, we have these two essays that are looking at David Gemmell and his Regante series. Alistair's essay itself is about the mythological side of it, so the figure of Cuchulainn as part of the trajectory of the main hero. And Anthony Smart is looking at classical ethnography and the way that the Roman world is interacting with the Celtic world. in the series. And then Cheryl Morgan's excellent Celts in Space, which I love the title of, which is looking at Kenley Morgan's Celtiad series, which is sort of, yeah, it's exactly what it says on the tins. It's Celts in Space. It's fascinating stuff. And Cheryl's done a brilliant work there. I think Cheryl is with us as well today. The third part is where we have Celtic fantasy beyond the Anglophone. And as Alistair was saying, we're particularly proud of this section. We need more work on non-Anglophone fantasy. That's something that the series is particularly keen to hear about if you're working on a topic like this. So we have Vivian Burke, who's writing on Leah Silhall's Vertigan and Frontier series. And again, these are multi-volume sprawling series that look at the Sidhe, the Celtic fairy world. And then we have Duncan Snedden's Gaelic History and Legends in Aimshuil, and I'm going to mispronounce the Gaelic now, although I try to learn very carefully how to say it, Aimshuil Du, which is, it's actually a school fantasy, a sort of campus fantasy in Gaelic. And the last part is the fantastic perceptions of Celticity, in which we're looking at broader themes. And this is where my former tutor, Dr. Juliet Wood, who taught me everything I know about folklore, did an amazing chapter on the Celtic tarot and how the tarot has been reconfigured as a Celtic thing. Is it a Celtic thing? Is it not? You need to read Juliet's essay to find out. And then finally, Angela Cox did a really brilliant article based on her PhD research on how fantasy fans are perceiving the Celtic in modern fantasy. And that was based on a methodology of questionnaires and field work. So generally, a really huge range of different approaches here, something that neither Alistair or I could have done on our own, to present all of this sort of range of material. So yeah, this is our book.
Will I go then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, here's my book. I'm Tim Murphy. My book is in the series of William Hope Hodgson and the Rise of the Weird, Possibilities of the Dark. It's my own third book, but it's the first I've done in the field of the fantastic. Alluding a little bit to what Brian said before, when I was in graduate school in the late 80s, the second Reagan administration, didn't seem like a very plausible thing to work on. And so I went into other areas and only came back to fantasy and science fiction and horror and the weird fairly recently. I attended the International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts in 2016 and presented the first bit of this book on William Hope Hodgson at that time. I think the book series itself is a beautiful piece of evidence that not only we readers and scholars, but students and clearly publishers recognize that the timeliness of fantasy studies, that there would be no series if it wasn't recognized to be something that speaks to a much greater audience than perhaps had been suspected in the past, and a much more diverse audience than had been suspected in the past. But what my book is not really about the timeliness of fantasy. It's more about the untimeliness, in the sense that Hodgson was a figure of who came into the field at a time of great, shall we say, confusion across the fantastic, at a time when the genres that we take for granted today were in the process of formation. And the process of genre formation that came afterward seems not to have found an appropriate place for him and his work. And this is one of the reasons I consider him to be an untimely writer. Fantasy itself, as I'm sure we all know, has become incredibly popular. And it's not only more popular than ever now, it seems to me, but it's drawing on many more diverse cultural sources than it ever has. And this is, I think, one of the things that's driving the boom, not only in fantasy publishing, but fantasy scholarship, of which we are participants, right? But what it has done at the same time, I think, is to, by focusing so much energy on the present and on the recent past, tended to reduce parts of the more distant past, especially those that don't fit into well-established narratives. In weird fiction, right, the stature of Lovecraft and the Lovecraft event has although it's become incredibly influential at the same time being deeply controversial, has in some ways, I think, forestalled wider consideration of other figures writing in the early 20th century in the weird tradition, much in the way that the Tolkien event and the adoption of the Tolkien model for so much of contemporary fantasy has tended to push into the shadows a lot of other figures who would seem to be at least of equal interest in some ways. So it's in that sense that I thought of my work as a structure, as a study in untimeliness, and how something that wasn't really timely when it came out could become timely some other time, at some other place, could speak to us in the way that it's becoming increasingly acknowledged in the field that weird fiction, which I do think of as distinct from fantasy in the same way that I think of it as distinct from science fiction, has come to be a category that many people are turning to in order to understand the situation of the Anthropocene, for example, and the limits of scientific rationality that are exposed in the crises that we are living through in the present, right? So it's in that sense that I tried to write this book. I didn't really have a very clear sense of who the audience would be. I hoped it would find one. I'm glad that it found at least one amongst the editors and reviewers of the series. I appreciate their efforts, because I suspect it probably took them longer to find referees for this book than perhaps for some of the other books, and I'm grateful to them for having done so. The project itself really started off when I was in graduate school, even though I didn't think of it that way. It's been a 40-year project, essentially, if I can put it that way. Starting from when I first discovered Hodgson's books when I got to college, but only coming into focus in the great thing. Thanks. I didn't know that. Thank you very much, Dimitra. It only came into focus really with the new weird, with the rise of of what some have called the new weird, and with again the theoretical approaches that have become possible, right? And other people have started to work on Hodgson as well. In fact, I held off on the book for a little while because I thought Emily Alder, I don't know if anyone knows Emily Alder's work, that Emily Alder would be doing a book on Hodgson instead, but she opted to do a more broad-based work on the weird in late Victorian culture, which is a wonderful book that I recommend. It's not in the series, so I probably shouldn't say too much about it. But it's an excellent book, and I could not have done my book without hers. Hodgson is a figure who imagines enormous distances of time and space and subjects us to them without any of the conventional defenses of religious faith, of scientific mastery, even of, in a sense, in many cases, even of sort of collective agency. His protagonists are almost always alone in the face of the radically alien. And they must make what sense of it they can of it. And this reflects, I think, his own experience too. The other thing I wanted to say before I sign off here is, I want to wish everyone a happy May Day. It's May Day today, which is the day that we generally acknowledge, celebrate, and support the struggles of workers, working people. And Hodgson is one of the first writers in this tradition to come out of a very working class background. He left school at the age of 14 to become a sailor, a merchant sailor, and later, after he left the merchant navy, tried to sell his services as a physical culture specialist, a bodybuilder, before settling on the writing of both fantastic and realist fiction in the magazines of the early 20th century. And so his career path very much differs from that of many of the major figures in the development of fantasy, who either begin from or aspire to a fairly a more conventional, shall we say, career path than what we associate with people like Hodgson. And so I try to make a case that his insights as a fantasist, as a creator of fantastic worlds, is inflected by not only the time he's writing, but by his own experiences with physical labor and manual labor. He's a non-intellectual weird fiction writer, contrary to the intellectualism of Lovecraft, right? And I think that opens, I'm hoping that opens up some way to think about the early history of weird fiction in terms of different categories than Lovecraft has bequeathed to us. I guess I'll leave it there and see if anyone has questions about it. But thanks very much.
If you do have questions, please feel free to add those in the Q&A. I think it's a really wonderful book. And I think one of the things I like about the first sort of slate of books in our series is how different they are. We have Taylor Drigger's book, which is the first book in the series about querying faith in fantasy literature. Then we have the Celtic collection that's avowedly focused on pretty contemporary works from a broad range of voices. And this wonderful deep dive into Hodgson makes us see him in new ways and see his strangeness. I think you do a wonderful job of contextualizing his life, but also his legacies and the way he's been interpreted and positioned and never quite fit in various versions of the weird, that his very particular distinctiveness. And then we have a couple of different books, and I think radically different books in various ways about Tolkien. So I'm going to hand over to Dimitri now just to say a little bit about Anahit Buruz's book. Anahit unfortunately couldn't be here today, and then we'll hear from Eric.
Sure, but very little in the sense that I'm not the author, but of course, again, Anahit couldn't be here today, but I've known Anahit for a long time, have always admired her work, and I love this project. I'm obviously a Tolkien scholar as well, so I am a bit biased here. So what Anahit's book is, do we have the link there? Sorry, should I do the link on the chat? You're doing that now. Perfect. So the title of Anahit's book is Mapping Middle-earth: Environmental and Political Narratives in J.R.R. Tolkien's Cartographies. And it's really a book about maps, but it's not really just about maps. And that's what I think is great about it. So Tolkien's maps have been discussed before, but often, or most of the time, are sort of auxiliary parts of enabling the reading experience, or sort of following through the journey of characters. Or following through, the more sort of cataclysmic events of the first and second ages. But what I think Anahit's book is doing really well is that it's going beyond that. It's moving beyond the sort of idea of the map as a paratext or just as an aid or an auxiliary element of the text. She's looking particularly at the idea of cartography, at the idea of who is creating maps, who is reading maps, what are maps for. What are the power structures that underline the whole sort of theorization and creation and practice of map making? Sorry, and of course a lot of the sort of real world power dynamics and structures around cartography are very much reproduced in fictional maps. So there is a great balance here between sort of the history of cartography as a literary practice, which is also sort of briefly tracing, and the book begins with the famous Robert Louis Stevenson point about Treasure Island started with a map. But at the same time, she's also looking at critical cartographical theory about all of these sort of tangled entanglements between maps and power. So who makes maps, who reads maps, what are maps for, what are maps representing, what are they not representing, what is on the map that isn't in the narrative, all of those things are important to have discussion. So again, I'll do a very quick sort of overview of the book. She's also working through a number of theoretical lenses, including eco-criticism, post-colonial perspectives, and also geographical theory as well as cartographical theory. So the first chapter of the book looks at the ways in which real world cartography has been bound up with questions of power, as I was saying before, but she's looking at that tradition both in the medieval context, which very much is part of, would have been part of Tolkien's bread and butter, sort of understanding how medieval maps work, but also the modern tradition of cartography, and then situates Tolkien's work in that. But at the same time, she's also tracing how the process of creating maps encodes issues of power, politics, ideology, all of those things. So in that introductory chapter, she's setting up a lot of the main concepts that follow up in the book. Then in the second chapter, she's looking at the relationship between humans and the environment, and cartography is there positioned as a tool to examine, the human versus nature sort of binary or represent actually the control that humans attempt to enact upon the natural world. So a lot of discussions there about exploitation, deforestation, big themes that are there throughout Tolkien's work, not just in The Lord of the Rings. Actually, that's another strength of this book, is that it's looking throughout the legendarium and picking up salient examples throughout the whole mythology, which is quite a feat. The third chapter looks at the ways in which maps and cartography in Middle-earth is connected with time and representing temporalities. And especially, she's particularly interested in how we can have a representation of human timescales, but actually non-human timescales as well. Because, of course, we have beings in Tolkien's world that are living through, they're sort of, immortal is not quite the right word. They have a serial longevity, they're there until there's something dramatic that stops their lives. But that gives us that gets her examining ideas of deep time, for example, that were also quite contemporary with some of Tolkien's writing, and thinking about how time is represented on a map and what that means again in terms of human dynamics with all the things that we're trying to dominate. And the fourth chapter then looks at conflicts over land, and these are very much sort of political conflicts, and how these conflicts over land perpetuate hierarchies of power. So in that one, she's looking at race, she's looking at racialization, tactics of imperialism, particularly really good work there on imperialism in Tolkien's work, both his sort of representation of imperialism, but also his critique of imperialism as well. And also how these practices are not just exploiting the land, but the people, the indigenous people of the lands as well. So some great themes that resonate with a lot of Tolkien's work, and as I said, some great examples that come throughout the legendarium. Very well written book as well. Very readable, despite the fact that there's quite robust sort of theoretical engagement. And I know there's quite a bit of there's been a good response in the Tolkien fandom as well as in Tolkien scholarship. So yeah, very proud of having this book in the series. I think I'm gonna stop here.
Also very proud of Eric Randall's book, so we'll let Eric talk about that one.
And that gets us to the next Tolkien book. Eric.
Hello. Well, first of all, I'd like to say it feels good to be in such great company. Look at this book series, and I'm really happy to be lined up with these others. So I'm in the religion department here at Emory University in Atlanta, and I've always been interested in what we refer to in an abbreviated form as East-West interactions. My first book was about British missionaries in China, and I've written about the Chinese macabre and so on, Western representations of China. And the fantasy thing was really just as purely as a hobby, as a fan. And I was going to Dragon Con for many years, and I began to look around at this kind of event, and began to think philosophically about what was happening here. I was also teaching a class called Religion and Fantasy, and I did write a kind of book of essays on Miyazaki. But and also in the context of teaching, I came across Brian Atterbury's work, which was really revelatory for me. But what to do with it all? So then I was in Beijing, and I'm in a bookstore near Beijing University, and I find a whole set of the 5 major works presented as a set. Here's The Hobbit. Don't be distracted by the fact that it's The Hobbit, and yet it's a picture from the Fellowship. Never mind that. And as I opened them, they were all shrink wrapped. And as I pulled off the shrink wrapping, I noticed that there were these two loose covers attached, included in it, so that if you're sitting in a classroom, you can be reading The Hobbit, but apparently you're reading this very boring school textbook on Marxism. So this is a Marxism, Principles of Political Economy. And I always wonder what Tolkien would have thought about that. Would it have made him cry or laugh? I don't know. But it's also, it got me thinking, again, philosophically, you know, what does it mean for The Hobbit to be sandwiched between, you know, Karl Marx and the Communist Party? You know, what does it mean in a different context linguistically? So I thought, well, I'll just looking at that first set of translations, I kind of pieced together a few observations and tried these out at the International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts, and seemed to get good response. So I had an article, submitted an article to the JFA, the Journal for the Fantastic in the Arts, but that was all. That was just about one translation, and I didn't know where it would go from there. But then turns out there's another translation, and then a little bit later there's a third translation, and that just exponentially increased the possibilities for analysis when you have three translations of the same texts, three so far anyway. So I, you know, the first thing that interested me was, how do you translate elf into Chinese? And if you look in a dictionary, there is a translation, jingling, but it's not a traditional word. It's a word probably coined in the late 19th century, probably in Japan initially. So in other words, you had Japanese and Chinese readers in the late 19th century reading English books, and they talk about elves, and they're like, what are these things? And there was no easily available category for them to just say, oh, that's what that is. Dragon, easy, no problem. You could just, that's an easy translation. But elf, well, what is an elf? What exactly is an elf, you know? So I got quite interested in the comparative imagination, the way in which we different cultures kind of project these casts of characters, these imaginary zoologies, you know, and divide them up in each in their different ways. So there's a chapter on what is an elf and some of the possibilities there. The book is in two parts. There's a more thematic first part about religion and fantasy. What's the difference? There's a chapter on translation, but bringing it together with some of what Tolkien said on fairy stories. There's a chapter on the books and titles, just the names of the whole series and the titles of the books. And then there's a chapter on genre, in which I ask, you know, what kind of a book is Lord of the Rings in Chinese genre, in the history of, you know, genre categories. So then part two is a series of topics of going through, looking at the original text and the different translations, gods and heathens, elves and men, race, hell and other theories, the afterlife, fate and doom, magical language. And my approach here is informed by what I was reading in translation studies, which was a very new field for me. In the sense that I was not very interested in evaluating each of the translations as whether it was accurate or not accurate. I haven't abandoned fidelity. It is still a criteria. It's simply not the most interesting criteria, because I wanted to see what sort of Gandalf would be available to, a quarter of the world's population, since if they weren't reading it in English. So I'm very much interested in, even in cases where I see something that's clearly a mistranslation. It's obvious they have misunderstood a term. Even then, I'm interested in, okay, but now what does Middle Earth look like? Now what sort of person is Boromir, and so on, without acknowledging that there are mistakes sometimes, but without sort of fixating on that as the only criteria. In the course of all of this, I did also get to know one of the translators, Deng Jiawan, or Joy Deng, who is the foremost principal translator of all things Tolkien. She's done all the major works and most of all the other ones as well into Chinese. And that's been a very interesting and fruitful conversation as well. Lastly, my next project is Dracula. And there are 3 complete Lord of the Rings translations. Basically, there's a few ambiguous early attempts, but basically 3. I don't know how many Dracula translations there have been. My current guess is about 12. So it'll be really interesting to line up 12 different translations of Dracula and do a sort of comparable exercise with them. So thank you very much for getting my book into this book series.
Thanks very much for offering it to us. It was one we were really excited to receive. We have not received our physical copies. I am also excited to receive those, but hopefully they will be out soon. Eric's book is published and is the most recent book in the series at the moment. We have a fair bit of time for questions, so if things have been brewing over at the back of your minds, do add those to the Q&A. If no one has immediate questions, Brian and I will come up with some things to ask. I just want, before we move into questions, I wanted to just thank our editor at Bloomsbury, Lucy Brown, who marshals this series for us and who's done a really amazing job. She manages the series, I think, with a real understanding of the materials that are going into it, of the kind of people who are writing for it. I've been very impressed by the standard of the peer reviews that she's marshaled for books. I am very fond of our black covers, single color designs, which I think tie it together, but also with the nuance for authors to ask for their own things. So the other thing that we're very grateful for Bloomsbury doing is that we put right in the contract for the series that everything must go into paperback so that it is affordable by fans as well as university libraries. So things will come out within 18 months of the hardback publication in paperback. The ebook formats will drop to paperback price or lower at that point. So hopefully that is a good thing that we can do. I think if fantasy scholarship is going to grow, people need to be able to access it, and so that was really important for us in thinking about what a series should do. Chris has just asked what are some of the books coming out next. I could place in the chat the link to the immediate next book, which is Alice Chapman Kelly's fan fiction as queer healing fem/authorship, and the Swan Queen ship Alice is here. I think this is one of the books. I'm excited about all the books in it, so I'm particularly excited about this one, both because of the sort of the brilliance of her readings and for just a book that seriously sits down with individual pieces of fan fiction and shows how wonderful and interesting those are as works, and also for the amazing sort of thinking about what fan fiction can do, what those spaces can do, how they're expanding the affordances of the genre for engaging with all sorts of different kinds of experience that we'll find it more difficult to access in mainstream media. In her case, what Once Upon a Time, the TV series, fails to do has been amazingly done, and in enormous numbers of different brilliant iterations in fan fiction. So I believe that book will be out later this year. We've got a few other books. I'm just looking in the front of Alex's book to see what we can announce. As I say, we're up to, I think it's 12, 13 or 14 commissioned into the series now. I'm not quite sure where everything else is. We've got Christina Bacalega and Pauline Greenhill's new book, Justice and the Power of Wonder in 21st Century Fairy Tales. So in Fairy Tale Studies, we've got Mayurika Chakravarti's Fantasy and the Politics of Subversion, Speculative Writing in Colonial India. So another book a bit like Tim's, looking at pre-Tolkien fantastic formulations, but they're in a subcontinental context. That's the books that I think
that's the ones we're allowed to talk about.
We're not allowed to say anything else, but there are at least three or four more commissioned in the series. So it will begin to form a lovely sort of sable ranks along a bookshelf as they sort of add. I'm hoping, I guess we will eventually run out of accent colours, but we've got plenty more to go before we get to that point.
Sure.
Let me just say also that I've gotten more compliments on the cover of mine than any of the other books I've been involved with, frankly. So it certainly is a very striking design set of design choices that were made. I was a little bit hesitant at first, but I've gotten so much positive feedback on it that it's changed my mind.
Mm-hmm. I think we underestimate book covers sometimes. We sort of, especially in academic books, we sort of leave them to, to the decision of the powers that be. But I think they're quite important. And I'm very glad.
Yeah, as a bookseller, they are very important in selling. I was really happy to be engaged quite a lot with the book cover of this one. We went back and forth quite a bit, didn't we, to get it just right, and get the color right. That was the big thing, because we didn't want it all white, did we? We wanted a bit of color in it. Yeah. So that's how we got to that stage.
We've got a question about whether there's a plan to see the books translated into Spanish. I would love it if there was such a plan, but I'm afraid there is not at the moment. If anyone is aware of publishers who would like to get in touch with Bloomsbury about translation, I'm sure Lucy would be very glad to hear from people. I mean, it's something we would love to see, but it is a difficult prospect for niche areas unless there's proof of interest from a publisher or a partner. But in that case, I think everyone would like more people to read their books, and we would be very keen for as many people as possible to read the amazing work that we've been able to publish in this series. Do keep adding questions to the chat. I might just ask a sort of a general question to the authors, picking up from Brian's point. I guess would you all be happy to say something about about how you see the kind of work that you're doing in your book, expanding that vista of fantasy scholarship that Brian's saying? What do we know? What do we see about fantasy or the fantastic through looking at the lenses that you're using your books that we would not have seen before?
It's a good question, that, isn't it? I think in our case, and again, Alistair, do come in and correct me or sort of add things if you want to. I think in our case, it is another dimension of how fantasy engages with the past, and what the past really means, because the idea of the Celtic past is, as I was saying before, quite complicated and quite contested. And different scholars from different disciplines will define it very differently. And then there is sort of a popular perception, which is a mishmash of different material. How fantasy authors are engaging both with that popular understanding, but also with the research, right, and with a more academic side of what Celtic means. Shows a lot about what the past means in fantasy. How much do we expect fantasy to be historically accurate? How much do we expect fantasy to be a more free interpretation of what the past was? And especially with the Celtic past, there are a number of political sort of complexities there as well. Thinking about things like Scottish independence, or sort of nurturing of the Welsh language in Wales, for example, or the Irish language in Ireland. These are all big questions that affect us today. You know, these are all very important things that a number of people in these countries are very much concerned with. So how fantasy intervenes in these sometimes very charged political debates is interesting, and also how sometimes it is not, you know, it's completely unaware of these debates and sort of goes on sometimes sort of old-fashioned ideas about the past. You know, all of that is fascinating, and I think it opens up possibilities about thinking about fantasy in the past.
This whole thing of with Norris and Doctor Strange with Celtic and English, and this Teutonic versus Celtic is quite a thing that happens even now, and authors are internalizing it and putting it through into their books. We see it in Tolkien doing the same thing, and then we see it in other authors doing the same thing. Even modern authors, the Iron Druid series does the same thing. It has this Celtic Teutonic conflict between each other. So it's something I've looked at before and done an article on, that it continually comes up in fantasy, this them and us between different elements.
Sure. Which in some ways are sort of, these go back to the 19th century, but some authors have really looked at how these things are moved on, or are very much engaged with the current political situations. Other authors are very much replicating, as Alistair was saying, a narrative that's quite old now and sort of has been bypassed. So also how fantasy, I suppose, engages with scholarship. What is scholarship's impact on fantasy is another topic here. Yeah.
But it seems to me that a lot of what is going on in fantasy scholarship now reproduces what I'm doing, certainly, and what I think some others are doing in terms of late 19th, early 20th century work, is a project of recovery, right? There have been stages of recovery in the history of fantasy fiction in the past, right? The Ballantine adult fantasy series was an attempt to bring a sense of genre history to the new readership opened up by Tolkien in the 60s and 70s, right? It seems to me that what a lot of us are trying to do now is to bring a similar kind of labor of recovery to the scholarship of fantasy in those earlier models, to ask about roads not taken, to ask to what extent is the division of the genre division. And so Eric's point about how do genres divide up in China? They're not going to divide up the same way as they divide up in Europe or in Britain or in North America, right? And the historical contingency of some of those transformations are worth recovering in order to ask about to what extent is this historical contingency still operating in the way that we parcel out our conceptions of the fantastic more broadly. I mean, I sometimes like to use John Clute's word fantastica to talk about the whole field, and then fantasy, science fiction, horror, weird fiction, folktale, etc. I mean, again, there's various ways that this can be divided up. And one can imagine that new kinds of cross-pollinations and cross-fertilizations become available once you begin to understand the contingency of some of these lines, and the contingency of some of the conflicts too, I would think, in terms of the cultural conflicts that are at the root of some of the unfortunate, shall we say, reactionary appropriations of fantastic logics and of fantastic worldviews and of the cultural traditions that underpin them, right? So it seems, I mean, I'm enough of an old Marxist to think that you always have to historicize in order to understand where things came from and where you might be able to take them in the future.
Well, I would say, firstly, just in terms of just trying to make our scope more global, I would really love to see much more, not just studies of fantastic things in other cultures, but of the interactions. Translation studies has been an eye-opener for me. I had always had very naive or just kind of homespun ideas about how, what it all means. But translation studies is this incredible, vibrant field. So that engagement with that would be, I think, a good idea. But more, not so much about scholarship, but what I see that I didn't see before is I'm reading a different Lord of the Rings now. For instance, for example, Tolkien loves the word doom. It's all over the place. But doom means several different things. Sometimes it means a legal judgment. Sometimes it means a judgment of death. Sometimes it means an unavoidable bad thing. Sometimes it means the end of days, and Chinese can say all of those, but there isn't one word that just means all of those things. So the translators are constantly having to figure out, okay, here's this word doom in this line, what am I going to focus on? Which one is it? And it's not always clear. So that now when I'm reading Tolkien, I've become more aware of the polysemy of at least some of his words. I'm kind of hearing Gandalf with a Chinese accent a little bit more. There's a kind of, it's changed my reading of the original text.
Brian, did you have something to?
Well, I was just thinking that all of this reminds me of a line from China Mieville that I've used more than once, which is that fantasy, he might have said science fiction, but is good to think with. And what I'm hearing is some of the things that it's good to think about through fantasy, and the way we carve up the world into different categories or group those categories into complex wholes. And I remember from the original article that Eric wrote about the translations that when you start to translate something like elf, you can't help moving into the theological, but that's not obvious to an English speaker. That why would you do that? Well, because and to make that journey over into the Chinese way of seeing the world, and then back into Tolkien's very British or adopted British way of looking at the world, is to complicate things and make us think about the way we think about those sort of spiritual things and complex categories and so on. Does that fit with any of what you're all seeing in your own works?
Did you see as much trouble with orc?
They just transliterate orc.
Okay.
So it's sort of, although one of them, one translator, Zhu Shehang, translates it as Qiongshouren or something, sort of strong beast person. So, what else are you going to do with orc, Yeah.
Yeah, there was an interesting case and an interesting article published a few years ago on the Greek translations of the Lord of the Rings as well, where we had a retranslation by the same person, but for a different time, for a couple of decades later, when I suppose Greece is now much more knowledgeable about what I would understand as sort of Western fantasy, and terminology had changed. So it's fascinating how these things move, even by the same translator.
Yeah, I think that considering translations, fundamentally you're considering reading.
Yeah.
So that even if you weren't imagine trying to paraphrase Lord of the Rings from English to English, you'd still end up with something profoundly new. Yeah, it's so in some ways thinking about translation is really about thinking about the simple act of any kind of communication, so that we're not reading it today in the 1950s. It's no longer when it was published. We're in a different world, which in some ways is as different as a cultural, linguistic difference.
And I'm just realizing now, actually, of course, in our edited collection, the two essays that looked at fantasy written in languages other than English, so the one on French fantasy and the one on Scottish Gaelic fantasy, also had bits of translation in them, obviously, because you are writing about a text that most of the readers reading an English scholarship book will not have read, and there might not be translations either. So especially the Scottish Gaelic book, there is no translation in English. So it's always part of the dilemma of should we be using English as the lingua franca to discuss these things, but at the same time it's a very new genre, sort of nascent genre in contemporary Scottish Gaelic literature. So again, this crossover between the methodologies, also the critical tools we have for fantasy, and the fantastic as it might be understood in a different language or in a different culture is fascinating. And I think I'd like to see more in the series of that. We'll see a bit of discussion on that in Mariuka's book that Matt mentioned earlier on. But we're very keen to have more on global fantasy and fantasy not centered on the Anglophone.
Got one question picking up on translation, and then there's a broader question about editors, but we'll pick that one up towards the end, I think, because that's probably quite a... So speaking of translation, I'm researching Palestinian fairy tales, and I'm constantly debating whether every fairy tale translation is itself a fairy tale. It feels like some translations are so faithful to the text to the extent that they lose their magic once read in the target language. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks, Eric. I think you touched on this already about the difficulty of the sort of accuracy was one of your criteria, but only one part of getting across the sense of a text.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe the most famous quotation on the subject of translation is poetry is what's lost in translation. I'm blanking on the guy's name, the poet.
I don't know, but it's the
path less traveled, the road less traveled guy.
Frost.
Frost, yeah.
Frost,
Yes.
Robert Frost, yeah.
Okay, he says, so poetry is what's lost in translation, but and people quote that and say, with the implication that, translation, it's kind of sad. If you can't do any better, read a translation, it's very sad. But he also, in that same quotation, he said, it's also what's lost in interpretation. Mm-hmm. So, the tendency, as I'm understanding the field of translation studies, is to oppose that perception of translation as a second best, and to read translations in their own right. So the question of fidelity versus, as the question asked about, contrasted that with magic, you lose a magic when you become obsessed with fidelity. That's maybe the core fundamental tension in all translation studies that I'm aware of. There's a great book by Karen Emmerich called Literary Translation and the Making of Originals, that addresses a lot of this question of the relationship of the original to translations. So I think that's it. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
I'll just throw in here that if we're thinking about translation and fantasy, everyone should read R.F. Kuang's Babel, which brings up the questions of power as well, and language as a form of power.
control. Yeah, sure.
Magic is powered by the gaps in translation. Sorry, Tim, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask whether anything on the series horizon might involve, for example, scholarship from other languages on works of fantasy. I'm thinking, or the work of fantasy writers and themselves in other languages. What brings it to mind is one of the most interesting contemporary Italian fiction writers is a collective called Wu Ming. They used to be called Luther Blissett. One of the members of that group, I don't remember which Wu Ming it is. They go by numbers, Wu Ming 1 through 4. But one of them is one of Tolkien's translators into Italian and has written extensively. He has several volumes of criticism of Tolkien, and also wrote a novel called The Morning Star, which is about Tolkien and Lawrence of Arabia and all these guys in the First World War. And it's about how all of these different modernist projects emerged from their experiences of the trenches and their experiences going back into British academia in the 20s and 30s. And it's a fascinating body of work that seems, as far as I know, completely unknown in English language Tolkien scholarship, for example. So that's just a question I have, if that's something that the series would be interested in the long term.
I mean, we because like we set it up to be a series about fantasy in the broadest terms. I think there will. I mean, there's the McFarland Critical Studies in Fantasy and Science Fiction, which has published a lot of good scholarship on fantasy, but there was not a there are other series, including the Liverpool series, that focus specifically on science fiction. We wanted, if you saw your work as being connected with fantasy, we want to read it. And we, in a couple of cases, we have had a couple of books that have seemed to us that they are more sort of fully located, for example, in Gothic studies. And so that we're happy to consider that work, but we would ask authors there whether they're going to find their readers more through the very well-established Gothic studies series. But if people want their work to be considered in the context of fantasy, bring it to us. We're keen to read it, and we're keen to sort of to listen to your arguments about why fantasy is the space that you feel you're working in. We're very happy to accept those arguments. In general, I think we're really trying not to be prescriptivists. We're trying to welcome everything that comes in on its own merits, try and find it good, fair readers, and then move it into print as swiftly as we can if we feel it's good, and if our readers concur. I wanted to ask you a quick question too about Hodgson. Like, I think probably 90% of people go in through the House on the Borderlands. Is that the right? Yes. Is that the right way in? Or if not, or even if it is the right way in, what would deeper cuts would you recommend from doing a complete survey?
That's certainly the one that people read first because it's the shortest and has the most substantive reputation. At the time I started reading them because I had read Lovecraft's monograph, Supernatural Horror in Literature, which was a very voluminous reading list, essentially, if you want to trace the evolutions of various kinds of horror and weird fiction up to the 1930s, roughly. And the original version of that didn't contain anything about Hodgson. He, as I say in the book, Lovecraft read Hodgson very, very late, was elated to discover him, and added him to the second edition of that in a revision process. And many people, certainly many people of my generation, I can't speak for the younger people who are reading weird fiction now, that was how I discovered Hodgson. I read about him in Lovecraft, and I went looking for the books, which were only in print in Britain at the time. And I got them at an import bookstore in Ithaca, New York in 1983. So that was the first chance I had to get a set of them. I was taken with The House in the Borderland, and it is a lot of fun. But I still think, though, that Hodgson's greatest achievement is The Night Land, both for its scale, it's 500 pages long, but also because of the way that it tries to encode in its very form, in the way he writes the sentences in a kind of sub-William Morris invented archaic English, to incorporate into the structure of the work the estrangement that the concepts themselves already produce. It's a vision of the world billions of years in the future, after the sun's gone out, and all of humanity that survives has isolated itself in 7-mile high metal pyramid, while outside in the remaining habitable lands of the Earth, alien creatures run wild, strange and crazy architecture that's never fully explained proliferates, and one person has to go out on a quest across this radically alien landscape. It's an incredibly powerful book. If you submit yourself to the language, that's why it requires something like a William Morris. I mean, I think Tolkien did it a little bit differently when he built his works out of his linguistic studies, but he incorporated the estrangement of the Elvish, the Dwarvish, and such in much more measured amounts, and so it doesn't put people off the way that sometimes Morris's stuff and sometimes Hodgson's can. But it does reward the extra labor that it sometimes requires.
Yeah, I read The Nightland as I was reading your book, actually, Tim, and I'm glad I did. I think I don't think I had given it a proper go before. It's quite an experience.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the chief cheerleader for Hodgson these days has been China Mieville, who sees him in many ways as a kind of exemplary figure in the alternative development of weird fiction and those elements of fantasy that lean onto the darker side of things, and especially into horror. And so his work is in many ways a kind of meditation on a lot of Hodgson's themes and a lot of Hodgson's techniques. So if you like China Mieville, you would probably find many things to like in Hodgson, especially if you like The Scar, the Mieville novel that is set on a floating city and that involves fundamental deviations from reality, scars in reality.
Let me just add, I first became aware of Hodgson through Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy, who has done a couple of stories that are very sort of sea-based.
Yeah. Mignola is maybe one of the most effective translators of weird fiction onto the page, onto the comics page, and helping onto the screen. So like the Hellboy movies are some of the best cinematic versions, I think, of a kind of weird aesthetic.
So there is room in our series to follow up on Timothy's book by looking at some other versions of it's often couched as science fantasy or dark fantasy, but I'm thinking of Gene Wolfe and the Shadow of the Torturer series, which is very Hodgson-esque, or Liz Hand's early work, and all of that we would welcome further study.
Yeah. Well, in Italian they call the whole field fantascienza, right? And that covers what we call science fiction, fantasy, and weird fiction for the most part. But it's just a single, more capacious and less internally subdivided category. I mean, I do a lot of translation from French and Italian, and again, even though they're a part of the European tradition, in that sense, closer to the Anglo-American models that we use, there are still some very interesting and striking differences in the way that the categories are constructed and deployed. And I think I totally agree with Eric that the translation opens you up to so many new and absolutely powerful questions that come into almost every aspect of your work as a critic and a scholar.
About 15 more minutes for the event. So if people have more questions, do formulate those and add them to the chat. Should we take this question for us as editors and we can just talk about that very quickly, and then we'll come back to the books to finish. So the question is, what have been the biggest challenges you faced launching an academic series on fantasy with an academic publisher, and or what has surprised you most about the process? I was just saying things, but my sense is that actually it's been easier than I expected, that we were pushing at an open door. But I will pass to Brian and Dimitra to say something first.
Well, the same, the fact that we were immediately sort of inundated with good, strong proposals meant that this was a project that was overdue. And as you say, our editor at Bloomsbury has been very good to work with and enthusiastic about all of this. So those are not difficulties I'm having trouble thinking of. I guess the difficulties have to do with making fine distinctions about like who are the best contributors to a volume like this, or how can we tweak something that's already a good proposal to make it even more appropriate for the readers that we are thinking of.
Yeah, I would echo those. I mean, I like to sort of paraphrase Gandalf a little bit here, who says, "I come back to you at the turn of the tide." I think the tide has turned in sort of both scholarship, yeah, and academic publishing, really. So there was no issues with rejections or anything like that. One of the reasons why we wanted to be with Bloomsbury is, as Matt was saying before, this agreement on all this commitment that books would go to paperback, which other publishers wouldn't necessarily commit to for any subject, right? So that was an important one. But also, we found that there was a good home there based on all the other work they're doing, all the other series that they're publishing. So no issues there whatsoever. That the tide has really and truly turned. And I think for me, that's also the experience that Brian was talking about before. I was thinking, I have so many things to do. Am I doing the right thing here and getting involved with a new book series? And I was thinking, it'll be quiet for a couple of years, won't it? No, it hasn't been quiet at all. It would be completely inundated, but it's been brilliant. It's been absolutely brilliant.
I think we were keen to take it to Bloomsbury because they've got a good record of moving things into paperback and we have to get them the series contract. I really, particularly for fantasy, my first book is 90 quid. There's a slightly cheaper paperback version, but I spent a lot of time on that book. I would like more people than the people who can afford that sort of sum to read it. And we thought this was a thing that we, as sort of the editors, if we negotiate that now, then people who might not have as much sway, who are coming in as authors of PhDs or first monographs, if that's written in and everyone gets it, then we can make that work more accessible. And like we went to Bloomsbury in part because Dimitri and I both worked with the publisher at Bloomsbury, and Ben Doyle, who now runs the Literary Studies List, also was at Emerald and Palgrave before. He's been very good in multiple roles at making sure, like working with authors. And yeah, so we took to the series for that reason, and for Bloomsbury's record. We also thought it was quite cool that people being published in our series be published by Susanna Clarke's publisher, which is a nice angle. And then yeah, they were happy. They were very happy to do that. I mean, we do get quite a lot of proposals. I guess like one of the challenges we have sometimes is like being aware that these are works that people have worked on for a long time and making sure that we give them fair readings, that we get good readers for them. And sometimes we've had proposals where we think this is a good project, but it's not quite there yet. So making sure that we can encourage people to continue developing work, which we will hope to publish further down the line. So I think not just being like, we hope that the answer you get from us is not just yes or no, but if we accept your proposal, like the sense that someone who really has engaged with it has read it and offered feedback. And if we're saying not yet, it's not like your work is dreadful. It's like, we think it's not right for the series at this time for these reasons. Here's something you can go away with. So that's something we were really keen to try and do, because fantasy is a fairly new scholarly field. We're very grateful to readers, both known and unknown to us, for the feedback that they've given on proposals. Lucy has been amazing at finding like the right people to respond to the different books we've had and their different focuses. So yeah, it's been like there's been a certain amount of work, but it's been really like enlightening and inspiring work to do. So
I also appreciate the fact that we have done one of the things I hoped we would do, which is to create a kind of community of fantasy scholarship, or not create, but provide yet another sort of anchor or forum for that kind of interaction. And some of that interaction goes on behind the scenes when we send things out to readers or solicit reviewers, but some of it you see on the pages of the books as well.
Can I ask? I'll do if you have more questions, add them to the chat. But I will ask a slightly cheesy question to our panelists of this, like, what would you like to see appear in later volumes of the series? We'll get into the teens soon, but which fantasy writers, which topics in the field of fantasy do you not think are being studied? And maybe some of the people who are younger scholars in our audience will pick up on these and run with some of these ideas if they're ideas that you are interested in but do not have time to run with yourself.
Mhm.
Hmm.
That's difficult because I know more than I can share. So I should probably wait and come last into that because there's stuff coming up that we can't announce.
Things we cannot yet say, but
Well, I would hope you have something on the horizon again that would be about. I mean, one thing that would really interest me would be a really good critical account of early women writers of fantasy. I'm thinking of like Hope Merleys, C.L. Moore.
Yeah.
C.L. Moore is one of my very favorites. I talk about her a little bit as a sort of disciple of Hodgson in ways, but it seems to me her work is amazing, was significant both in fantasy as a genre and in science fiction. And I mean, there's a few articles. I think did Susan Gubar? Is it one of either Gilbert or Gubar wrote a really interesting essay early on, but there's been so little comparatively about her, and very even less it seems on Merleys in a lot of ways. Though she's also seems to be coming back into her own as a modernist poet. But there are other figures too. Those are just the two who leap most immediately to mind in terms of establishing early benchmarks for the development of high quality literary fantasy.
I probably would like to see a lot more a continuation of what we've been doing. So much more contemporary modern authors, so Tad Williams, Robert Jordan, Edding, so going forward even more and actually getting even the stuff that's coming out now. So it would be really good to get more of those coming in because that's what we're reading now. What people in the bookshops are taking away and reading now straight away would be nice to look and analyze.
Hoping we'll get a Guy Gabriel Kay book soon. I'm not sure about that, but that would.
Well, I don't know what should be coming up, but I remember a few years ago, I was looking around and I really wasn't finding a lot that was satisfying me on William Morris's late novels, The Well at the World's End in particular. There may be stuff I'm unaware of, but that feels like a major gap as far as I'm aware of. The other area I would say is graphic novels. We are really in the golden age. I don't know if it's going to get more golden, but you know, just the sheer volume, you know, now we've broken free of the goddamn superhero. The medium has you know every month there's amazing stuff being published, and so I feel like there was a recent graphic novel called The Bright Heavy, and a lot of stuff coming out of Fantagraphics that's really unlike anything I've seen before. So maybe something in graphic novels.
Something on graphic novels.
Hellboy as well, Mignola's work as well.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess
one of the questions Q&As mentions game.
Yes,
and not only computer games, but the whole phenomenon of tabletop gaming and role-playing games.
Yes, we're very happy to publish works on board games or D&D or video games. We're hoping we will get more submissions on those as we move forward. We wanted to sort of be open to a coverage of fantasy across a whole range of cultures, but also across a whole range of forms. So yes, if you have a brilliant book on fantasy comics or any particular fantasy comic artist or writer or artist-writer, do send us those. We would be glad to have those, glad to have games, glad to have film and television as well. While the three of us are literary scholars, we're all fairly Catholic in our interests across across a range of forms. We can definitely find good reviewers for those works if you want to bring them to us.
And more left field things like, I don't know, fantasy and poetry, which is something that I would love to read. I can't do it. I can't read it, but I'd love to read it if somebody would be happy to have a go. Matt, I'm just realizing we are 4 minutes from the end, and I want to quickly let people know about what's coming up for the centre. Is that all right?
Yeah, I'll just quickly.
Have I missed any questions?
I think we're done with questions. There's a few other suggestions in the chat about sort of R.F. Kuang, Rebecca Roanhorse, Tracy Dion, other very contemporary fantasies. No one is too new to be of interest to us. So
That's true.
So.
Sure. So just it's as we're coming to the end, I just want to let you know that our next big thing is our annual fantasy conference online, and that's GIFCON, Glasgow International Fantasy Conversations. And I'm putting on the chat the link to the official sort of university website that'll give you details about dates and keynotes. But I'm also going to put on the chat now the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic blog and the link to the program for this year's GIFCON. And the theme this year is Conjuring Creatures and Worlds. And we have some very exciting keynotes coming up. This is a completely free online conference with a Discord chat and discussion, like replicating the discussions in the corridors happening at the same time. The tickets are going fast. So just don't wait too long, because we've opened as many as we can, but Zoom has a capacity that cannot be, we can't go over what it can support. So do join us for that. There's all sorts of different approaches to fantastic there, including different media, including both sort of literary fantasy and novels and short stories, but also games and TV narratives and art and all that. And I think then there's the deadline has just now gone, but I know some of you have been asking about and will be joining us for our fantasy summer school at the end of June. And I think that's more or less it. There will be some exciting things happening in partnership with WorldCon, which is happening here in Glasgow in August. So keep an eye on our blog and on our social media for an announcement for that. But yeah, we're getting quite excited about this as the date is coming close. And yes, if you want to keep in touch, again, I either check our website or our social media, but via our main page for the centre, you will also find a Get Involved tab, and through there you can subscribe to our newsletter as well, so that you have news directly on your inbox. I should be able to find that link somewhere, but I can't find it right now.
We've got a philosophy and fantasy conference that students are organising, which is coming up in June as well, which is also listed on the site, I think. And
fantastic. Thank you, Matt. The conference on fantasy and philosophy, which again, that there's another topic, that still needs a lot of work. So I'm getting very, very excited about that one as well. That's a hybrid one. So again, have a look at our website and our blog. I'm trying to find the direct link for that. I should have put all of this together before. Sorry.
So we will locate that. But thank you all for coming along to this event, and thanks in particular to our authors. Go buy their books, or at least bookmark their books, so that when the price drops to human affordable prices, you can buy their books, or order them for your libraries and then buy them in paperback. They are wonderful books. I hope you will enjoy them. And so thanks to Eric, thanks to Alistair, thanks to Tim for coming along, and thanks to Brian and Dimitra. And thank you to you all for your questions and for this wonderful array of emotes that are appearing. It's really good that you're enjoying this event, and submit your books to the series as you write them. We will be very keen to see them.
Keep them coming. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all, everyone.